In 1940, Hermann Göring sat at the top of what was still the most feared air force in the world. The Luftwaffe had crushed Poland, broken France, and driven the British Army off the continent. German aircraft dominated European skies, and Göring believed he understood air power better than any man alive. So when reports began circulating that the United States intended to produce 50,000 military aircraft in a single year, his reaction was not concern, it was laughter. To Göring, the number was absurd, propaganda, industrial fantasy. America, he believed, lacked the discipline, experience, and technical coordination to even approach such figures. Germany had built the finest air force in Europe through expertise and control. Numbers alone, he assumed, meant nothing. What Göring did not understand was that the United States was not trying to copy the German model of air power. It was abandoning it entirely. At the time, America had no combat-proven air force to speak of. Its pilots were inexperienced. Its aircraft designs were still evolving. Its military bureaucracy was slow and fragmented. These weaknesses reinforced German confidence. Intelligence assessments described American industry as powerful but disorganized, capable of producing consumer goods in large quantities, but untested in the demands of modern war. Göring saw no reason to worry. Aircraft production, in his view, required skilled labor, careful coordination, and time. Germany struggled to expand output even under total mobilization. The idea that the United States could leap from relative unpreparedness to industrial dominance seemed laughable. Yet behind the scenes, something unprecedented was taking shape. When the United States began rearming, it did not focus first on tactics or doctrines. It focused on systems. Factories were redesigned, production chains were simplified. Aircraft were broken down into thousands of components that could be built simultaneously across the country. Automobile manufacturers, appliance companies, steel producers, and chemical plants were pulled into a single national effort. This was not a military buildup in the European sense. It was an industrial conversion on a continental scale, and it was happening faster than German intelligence realized. Göring's confidence rested on assumptions forged in a different kind of war. In Europe, air forces grew through refinement. Better engines, better pilots, better designs. Quantity followed quality, slowly. The United States reversed that logic. It accepted imperfection in exchange for speed. Aircraft did not need to be flawless. They needed to exist in numbers large enough to overwhelm any opponent. Training pipelines expanded alongside production lines. Losses were anticipated before the first plane ever flew. American planners did not ask how to avoid attrition. They asked how to survive it indefinitely. When American officials publicly announced their goal of 50,000 aircraft, Göring dismissed it as psychological warfare. Even if the Americans tried, he believed, they would collapse under the complexity. Supply shortages, labor bottlenecks, technical failures, these had limited every air force before. Germany itself was already feeling the strain. Göring assumed the same constraints applied universally. He did not grasp that American industry was being restructured to remove those constraints entirely. Within a year, the first signs of miscalculation appeared. Production figures began rising faster than expected. New factories came online. Output doubled, then tripled. Instead of slowing, the pace accelerated. German intelligence reports grew more frequent, more urgent, and more difficult to explain away. The Americans were not struggling, they were scaling. And the original goal of 50,000 aircraft was quietly becoming irrelevant. What Hermann Göring had laughed at as impossible was no longer a question of if, but how far. The number that once sounded like fantasy was about to be eclipsed, not narrowly, not barely, but catastrophically. And by the time Göring realized what was happening, the production machine was already beyond anyone's control. Because the truth was far worse than German leadership imagined. America was not going to build 50,000 planes. It was going to build 100,000. By 1941, German intelligence no longer treated American aircraft production as a curiosity. It had become a problem, one that defied traditional logic. Reports coming out of the United States showed factories expanding at a speed unseen in Europe. Entire plants were being constructed in months, not years. Production lines were designed before the buildings that would house them were finished. This alone alarmed German analysts, but what truly unsettled them was how the Americans approached the task. They were not trying to perfect aircraft. They were trying to industrialize war itself. In Germany, aircraft production remained complex and specialized. Each model had variations. Each factory relied on skilled laborers trained over years. Changes required retooling, retraining, and delays. Even under Göring's authority, production increases came slowly and at great cost. The Luftwaffe was powerful, but fragile, dependent on precision, experience, and control. The American approach discarded all three. Aircraft designs were standardized, parts were interchangeable, tasks were simplified so that workers with minimal training could perform them. If a process slowed production, it was eliminated. If a design change reduced output, it was rejected. Speed ruled every decision. The most dangerous American advantage was not technology, it was replication. Engines, fuselages, wings, and instruments were produced in different states by different companies, then assembled as if they were pieces of furniture. Automobile manufacturers applied assembly line logic to aircraft. Consumer goods companies retooled overnight. Entire supply chains were synchronized under centralized planning that ignored traditional military boundaries. For the first time, war production functioned like mass manufacturing, not craftsmanship. German intelligence struggled to communicate the implications. Numbers alone sounded exaggerated. 50,000 aircraft still seemed unrealistic, even as production climbed. Göring and his staff remained convinced that output would plateau, that bottlenecks would appear, that labor shortages or raw material constraints would slow everything down. They did not understand that the United States had anticipated these problems before they emerged. Labor was recruited nationwide, including women and minorities previously excluded from heavy industry. Training programs were compressed. Raw materials were allocated by priority. Nothing was left to chance, and nothing was allowed to slow the machine. Then came the shock that no one in Berlin had planned for. In 1942, American aircraft production did not stall. It exploded. Monthly output figures exceeded German annual projections. New bomber models rolled off lines faster than German intelligence could identify them. Factories like Willow Run were no longer building planes. They were producing them continuously. One bomber every hour, then faster. German analysts recalculated their assumptions again and again, each time reaching the same conclusion. This was no longer a competition of air forces. It was a competition between industrial systems, and Germany was losing it badly. What terrified German planners most was the implication for the future. If the United States could build aircraft faster than they could be destroyed, then attrition, Germany's greatest weapon, became meaningless. Losses no longer weakened the enemy. They only accelerated production. Every American bomber shot down justified another factory expansion. Every pilot lost was replaced by 10 in training. This was not an arms race. It was a runaway process. Hermann Göring's earlier laughter began to vanish from the record. Publicly, he continued to project confidence. Privately, his tone changed. Reports became sharper. Demands became harsher. Blame began to shift. But none of it mattered. The system Germany relied on could not be transformed quickly enough. Aircraft production remained constrained by complexity. Repairs drained resources. Fuel shortages worsened. Pilot training shortened. The Luftwaffe was being hollowed out at the exact moment its enemy was growing stronger by the month. By the end of 1942, the original American target of 50,000 aircraft had already been surpassed. And the year was not over. For Göring, the realization came too late. The impossible number had never been a ceiling. It had been a warm-up. By 1943, the scale of American aircraft production had reached a point where German leadership could no longer rationalize it away. This was no longer a temporary surge, no longer a propaganda exaggeration, and no longer something that could be countered through improved tactics alone. The numbers were real, and they were relentless. American factories were now producing aircraft faster than Germany could replace losses, faster than pilots could be trained to shoot them down, and faster than German industry could even comprehend. What Hermann Göring had once dismissed as fantasy had become a structural threat to the survival of the Reich. The consequences appeared first in the skies over Europe. Allied bombing raids no longer came in limited waves that could be disrupted, delayed, or partially intercepted. They came in formations so large that German fighter control struggled to manage them. Even successful interceptions barely dented the overall force. Where once German pilots had measured success in aircraft destroyed, now they watched bomber streams stretch from horizon to horizon. Losses that would have crippled any other air force barely registered in American planning. The Luftwaffe was still fighting with skill and courage, but it was fighting mathematics, and mathematics was winning. German intelligence reports became increasingly grim. Analysts noted that American production no longer responded to battlefield conditions. It moved independently, driven by schedules and quotas rather than victories or defeats. Destroying a factory no longer slowed output because production had already been distributed across dozens of locations. Knocking out one plant simply shifted pressure elsewhere. The system absorbed damage without collapsing. It adapted. Germany, by contrast, had concentrated production that could be disrupted with targeted attacks, something the Allies began exploiting with precision. For Göring, the psychological impact was as severe as the strategic one. His authority had been built on the Luftwaffe's early successes, on the belief that air power could decide wars quickly and decisively. Now, air power was still decisive, but no longer his. German pilots flew more missions with fewer aircraft. Training hours were cut. Fuel shortages worsened. Replacement planes arrived late or not at all. Meanwhile, American crews rotated, retrained, and returned with growing experience. Attrition no longer favored Germany. It devoured it. What made the situation unbearable for German leadership was that nothing could stop the flow. American aircraft were not just bombers. They were transports, fighters, trainers, reconnaissance planes, an entire ecosystem of air power expanding simultaneously. Even as Germany attempted emergency measures, the gap widened. Every adjustment came too late. Every reform was overwhelmed by scale. The Luftwaffe was being outproduced, outnumbered, and outpaced all at once. By the end of 1943, the unthinkable became undeniable. The United States had not merely reached 100,000 aircraft, it had normalized that level of output. The impossible number that Hermann Göring once laughed at had transformed into a permanent reality. The war in the air was no longer about who flew better or planned smarter. It was about who could continue indefinitely and who could not. From that moment forward, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Germany could still fight. It could still resist. But it could no longer win the war of production that now defined everything above the battlefield. The laughter had stopped. What remained was the sound of engines, tens of thousands of them, filling the skies, day after day, without end. By 1944, the consequences of America's aircraft production were no longer theoretical. They were visible every day, in every major operation, and over every German city. What had begun as an industrial statistic now dictated strategy, morale, and survival. German commanders no longer planned operations based on what they wanted to do, but on what the enemy's production allowed them to survive. Every calculation started with the same assumption. The Americans would always have more planes tomorrow than today. For the Luftwaffe, this realization was devastating. Fighter units were stretched beyond exhaustion. Pilots flew until they were killed, wounded, or simply worn down beyond usefulness. Training programs were shortened to dangerous levels. New pilots arrived at the front with minimal flight hours, facing opponents who rotated home, retrained, and returned with growing experience. Aircraft that should have been grounded were kept flying. Spare parts were cannibalized. Fuel shortages grounded planes that still could have fought. The Luftwaffe was not defeated in a single battle. It was outproduced into irrelevance. American air power, by contrast, expanded without pause. Long-range escort fighters appeared in numbers Germany had never anticipated. Bombers no longer needed to turn back for lack of protection. Raids reached deeper, struck harder, and returned more often. German cities, factories, and rail networks were hit repeatedly, sometimes within days of repair. Every bomb that fell further weakened Germany's ability to respond industrially, a feedback loop that accelerated collapse. The more America produced, the less Germany could. Hermann Göring attempted to adapt, but adaptation required time Germany no longer had. Emergency programs were launched, new aircraft designs were rushed into service, promises were made of miracle weapons and decisive reversals, but none of it addressed the core problem. Germany was still building aircraft the old way, specialized, complex, dependent on skilled labor and intact infrastructure. America was building aircraft as if they were consumables. Loss was assumed. Replacement was guaranteed. This difference alone decided the air war long before the final battles were fought. Even when Germany achieved tactical success, it changed nothing. Shooting down dozens of bombers no longer delayed future raids. It only increased American output and hardened resolve. German pilots reported a growing sense of futility, the feeling that every victory was temporary, every effort erased by the next wave. The sky was no longer contested, it was being occupied. By late 1944, the truth was unavoidable. The Luftwaffe could no longer protect Germany, its armies, or its leadership. The air war had been lost not through a single failure, but through a fundamental misunderstanding of what modern war had become. Göring had believed air power was about control and expertise. The Americans had turned it into a question of endurance and scale always wins. The final irony was brutal. The man who had laughed at the idea of 50,000 aircraft now commanded an air force that could not even replace its losses. The numbers that once seemed ridiculous had rewritten the rules of warfare. By the time Göring fully understood this, Germany was fighting under skies it no longer owned. And there was still one final realization left to confront, one that made the numbers truly terrifying. Because 100,000 planes had not been the end of America's production. It was only the point where Germany stopped mattering in the air. By the final months of the war, Hermann Göring no longer spoke publicly about numbers. The laughter, the mockery, the certainty that had defined his early confidence were gone. In their place was silence, deflection, and desperation. The skies over Germany told the story more clearly than any report ever could. Allied bombers flew by day and night, often unopposed, sometimes escorted by fighters that ranged freely across the Reich. Entire cities burned while German anti-aircraft guns fired until barrels glowed red, knowing the next wave would arrive regardless. The air war was no longer a contest. It was a condition, permanent, overwhelming, and irreversible. For Germany, the tragedy was not simply that America had built 100,000 planes. It was that this production had changed the nature of defeat itself. In earlier wars, losses forced negotiations or pauses. In this war, losses triggered acceleration. American factories did not slow when aircraft were destroyed. They expanded. Workers were added. Shifts multiplied. New plants came online. The system absorbed destruction and responded with growth. German planners had never faced an enemy like this, not because of ideology or tactics, but because of industrial inevitability. Göring's original assumption, that air power depended on elite pilots, advanced machines, and tight control, had been correct in one context. It was wrong in a world where war had become industrialized beyond human scale. The Luftwaffe had been built for decisive campaigns, not endless replacement. Once Germany lost the ability to dictate tempo, it lost the air war entirely. No tactical brilliance could compensate for a system that could replace everything you destroyed, faster than you could destroy it. In the end, the numbers told a story that strategy could not escape. American aircraft filled the skies not because they were invincible, but because they were replaceable. Pilots rotated, Crews trained continuously. Machines were built, lost, and rebuilt without pause. Germany, by contrast, clung to the idea that quality could offset quantity long after the evidence proved otherwise. By the time that belief collapsed, there was nothing left to change. Hermann Göring survived the war, but his reputation did not. The man who once commanded Europe's most feared air force became a symbol of arrogance undone by reality. His laughter at the idea of 50,000 planes would echo long after the war ended, not as a joke, but as a warning. A reminder that modern war is not always won by genius or courage, but by systems that never stop moving. The United States did not defeat Germany in the air with a single breakthrough or a single battle. It defeated Germany by making air power inevitable. By the time the world realized what 100,000 planes truly meant, the outcome of the war had already been decided. Because when numbers become unstoppable, even the most confident men run out of answers.